Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was entrusted with a legendary gift. When Naruto is given a gift considered legendary even in a world where walking on water is a daily occurrence for some, will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of said gift leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 89, Blood 3. Naruto sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the far wall, completely immersed in his thoughts as Fu slept peacefully to his left. Briefly he turned to look at her, a smile slipping over his features as he just watched her chest rise and fall for what felt like hours, but was more likely a minute or so. Gently he brushed away a strand of hair that had fallen across her eyes, chuckling silently to himself as the girl smiled in her sleep and nuzzled into the contact. However, slowly the smile slipped away from his features and his eyes became foggy as he forced himself to look away. "It's time, Naruto." The surprisingly soft voice, like the low, unthreatening purr of a cat, rang through his head, urging him to move. Naruto didn't budge though, still just sitting there in his indecision, his eyes glancing back at Fu's peaceful form every few moments. "She will understand, you said that yourself." Again the blonde didn't find the energy within himself to try and leave this comfortable position. In the warmth of the room, with Fu there by his side, he could briefly forget himself and the worries that rested on his shoulders. For a moment he could ignore all those problems and just pretend he lived a normal life with the girl he loved. However, reality, the harsh and cruel tormentor of the soul that it was, eventually swept in on his warm little moment, forcing his body to get up and move away from that very same girl, all because the young monk, above all else, wished that she would be safe. He grabbed his shikuju and tsujigasa on the way out, strapping the hat over his long mane of hair before stepping out into the rain of Ames streets. The wind whipped at his traveling cloak, forcing him to tilt his wide-brimmed hat to keep the worst of the harsh rain away from his face. "You know what to do, Naruto." Giving one last longing look at the tall metal tower that stood as the highest point in all of Amagakure, briefly framed by a bright blast of lightning that illuminated the pitch-black sky, the blonde nodded slowly. "Kuchiyos." He mounted the enormous bird summon that appeared before him quickly, jumping up onto its back, and allowing it to immediately take off with great beats of its powerful wings. Despite the howling winds that rushed by his form, ruffling the massive feathers of the strangely proportioned bird he rode, Naruto found his surroundings oddly muted as he undertook the long journey in silence, lost in his thoughts. Finally, after maybe an hour of simple self-contemplation, as well as looking forward to what he was about to do, ironic in that he wasn't looking forward to the task in the slightest, he closed his eyes and allowed his consciousness to sink away to that familiar place. When his rippled eyes opened though, it was not to the familiar locale of the seal, with its darkened passageways and great equilateral room containing the biju. Instead, he found himself sitting on what appeared to be a perfectly tranquil lake, or at least a large body of water. It stretched on seemingly endlessly, merging with what he assumed was the sky, although it appeared as little more than a large blankness akin to an untainted canvas for some future masterpiece. From what he could see, he was the only one in this odd, empty world, at least until a large ripple passed beneath him. "This is new." When he turned, it was toward the visage of the Kyuubi. He too was looking around the tranquil space, sitting on his hind legs with his long tail slowly swaying behind him. Each movement of the long furry appendages sent surprisingly small ripples through the waters, quickly dying out so as not to disturb its almost mirror-like stillness. "Where are we?" The fox grunted as it lay down, seemingly having discovered everything it needed to about the odd space they occupied. "Your guess is as good as mine, although I imagine this is the seal's answer to mine and the other biju's presence." When Naruto remained silent, the fox simply pointed down with one of his tails, prompting Naruto to look beneath them. He raised an eyebrow when he realized they weren't as alone as he had thought them to be, as beneath the crystal-like waters he saw the rest of the biju. Their forms were inverted as if merely reflections of beings that weren't there. Long silvery chains wrapped around each of their necks, and with a small start Naruto realized that when he traced them back to their source, it was him. A loop of thin, tarnished gray chain, no thicker than a few strands of hair, was wrapped around his hand. He hadn't even noticed it before. After a moment's hesitation where he considered just how badly this could backfire on him, Naruto gently slipped the chain off his hand, letting it fall into the still waters without even a ripple. It dissolved instantly, as did the much larger chains binding the rest of the biju. The blonde nearly fell backwards as the previously calm waters suddenly surged and bubbled ominously as one by one, starting with Shikaku, the rest of the biju burst from the water, rising up until they too were sat atop its surface that had once again taken its mirror-like finish. However, they seemed far more confused than he or Kurama did, although it didn't take long for their attention to fall on him, making as quickly realize they were now in a circle around him. Well, this is an all too familiar scene. A voice Naruto didn't recognize finally spoke up after a long moment of the biju glancing at one another, either in confusion or thinly veiled conceit. He turned, taking in the presence of the Hachibi as it, surprisingly, grinned down at him, its long octopus-esque tentacles swaying happily. Hachibi. The octopus raised a massive meaty hand as its grinning features took on more of smirk, which seemed odd coming from what for all intents and purposes was a snout. You can call me Gyuki. Matatabi told me a lot about you, Naruto, and beheld you in high regard. For a moment Naruto saw genuine sadness flicker across the Hachibi's face, and the blonde suddenly felt uncomfortable in the knowledge that he had been the one to finally send Karabi to the other side. So, I can consider us friends. That was enough to make the young monk pause. That was it? From his experiences with the other biju, the Kyuubi mostly, he hadn't been sure what to expect from the second strongest of their kind. Open acceptance and even friendship were certainly not possibilities, although from the way Karabi got along with his tenants so easily, he was hard-pressed to remember why. Okay, thank you, Gyuki. The bull octopus simply grinned in response, offering out a large, clenched fist toward the blonde. After looking at the offered hand in confusion for a few moments, Naruto hesitantly bumped his own fist against the meaty appendage, widening the Hachibi's grin. We'll get along just fine, Naruto. It's a pleasure to finally see you face to face. Naruto nodded slowly, the weirdness of this entire situation slowly being forgotten. Stranger things had honestly happened to him. A loud and gruff snort ruined the moment, though, prompting the Hachibi to look up, a picture of disdain and irritation on his features as he glanced at the old fox. Shame I can't say the same for you, Kurama. Still an egotistical asshole bent on the idea our tails mark out our favor with father? The Kyuubi grinned viciously as his tail swayed more energetically, his red eyes cold and hard. Still a pathetic weakling slave to the whims of humans? A low growl ripped its way out of Gyuki's throat, at least until it was drowned out by a frantic and low buzz as the Nanabi suddenly placed itself between the two glaring brothers. Damn it, I refuse to play peacemaker for you two yet again. Despite the statement though, Chome didn't move from her position, hovering between two of the most powerful entities in the world. However, its droning, buzz-like voice finally caused the two biju to break their glaring contest, leaving an awkward silence permeating the air after the Nanabi returned to her spot in the circle. So now what? All eyes once again returned to the young monk stood among titans as his own gaze drifted along them all, gaining mixed reactions when his rippled eye fell on each biju. That would be up to you, Naruto. It was Matatabi that spoke up, her soft but loud voice, like a crackling flame, breaking through the tension. We understand what you are doing, and the necessity of your actions, and you have our support despite your reluctance to claim it. Son Goku's commanding tones filled the silence before Kurama finally took over, his booming presence feeling almost like a visible weight. A long time ago our father assembled us in a manner similar to this. He gave us our names and told us that at some point in the future we would be brought together again. I would almost say that it is your destiny to stand where you are standing now, but... Naruto actually whitened his eyes slightly as Kurama looked down for a moment, his furry brow furrowed in hesitation, something Naruto had never seen from the stalwart, confident and arrogant fox. But destiny rarely seems to apply to you. An orphan and an outcast, yet possessing a greater power than many on this earth could ever comprehend and lacking the malicious intent to use it how so many of your kind would. Madara's unspoken name rang in the monk's mind, bringing him back to what he was about to do. Thank you. Once again, the Kyuubi shocked him by lowering his head slightly, not by much, as if in deference, but enough to at least convey a modicum of respect. I must say, being contained within you was far from what I had expected given your predecessors, but the experience has not been wholly unpleasant. Naruto smiled at that, hearing the message Kurama didn't say, but still conveyed with his carefully selected wording. It's been my honor to know you all, and my privilege to have your trust. My promise remains, that I will never break it, and you will all have your peace. Despite the slight derisive snort from the Kyuubi, Naruto faded away from that strange white world with a smile on his face. Many of the doubts plaguing his mind had evaporated. You sure know how to pick your containers, Kurama. The fox's eye twitched slightly at the thinly veiled barb from the Hachibi before another vicious grin tore across his features, even as the biju began to fade from the gathering space. At least he doesn't rap. It took another 3 hours of flight at high speed before Naruto felt comfortable with the place he had picked. It was far out west, beyond even the westernmost borders of Tsuchi no Kuni, where few bothered to travel anymore. Little lived out here in the harsher wastelands filled with little vegetation and fewer animals. It was perfect for Naruto though, and as his summon swooped to the ground, displacing great plumes of dust with powerful wing beats in the process, he looked up. Out here, far from everything and anything, the sky was beautifully clear. A large full moon hung overhead in the sky like some great glittering white bead, and it was framed by the thousands of pinpricks that made up the night sky. The bird summon vanished in a loud burst of smoke, ruffling Naruto's Haori before the air became still again. There really was nothing here, not even a wisp of wind to indicate time was even flowing, only the faint glow of green that covered the land, almost unnoticeable to the blonde after so long of seeing it, reminded him that even in wastelands like these, nature still existed. It was a comforting thought as he began to slowly mold and shape his chakra, culminating in him slamming his hand on the ground as a sealing matrix, far larger than any he had seen before, spread out from his palm. Kuchiyos no Jutsu. A cloud of white smoke, larger than anything he had attempted, or even thought about summoning before, erupted in the space in front of him, taking a long time to clear away. When it did though, a frightening stony visage greeted him. A beast, with blindfolded eyes and manacled hands, sat in a deceptively peaceful cross-legged position. Naruto knew this was the Gedamazu from Nagato's memories, but the sheer unease he felt from the malicious creature's aura was hard to express in words. It was like, despite its covered eyes, it was attempting to peer into him, through his body to the chakra he contained within, its chakra if Kurama was to be believed. I had begun to wonder if you would actually do this. Thanks for not disappointing. Naruto turned slowly towards the voice, seeing the masked man step out from a swirling vortex of twisted air. He had changed, wearing a long purple battle robe and donning a full-head white mask with the pattern of a fully evolved Sharingan imprinted on it, 2 of the tomo serving as eyeholes. However, the sight within those darkened recesses was enough to make Naruto grit his teeth. The man's left eye had been replaced with a Rinnegan, Nagato's Rinnegan. It was no doubt so that the man could control the stone behemoth in front of them. Whatever you are planning won't work. Despite his eyes being partially shadowed by the mask, the glow the 2 different Dojutsu gave off was enough to see one of his eyebrows raise slightly in a mocking gesture. Oh, because you contain all of the biju? The lilting tone, as if the man was completely carefree, was enough to put Naruto on edge. The fact he knew about his 9 tenets was surprising, but it at least confirmed something Naruto had been suspicious of since fighting Kurabi. You knew, you planned for it. Again, despite being hidden behind porcelain, Naruto could practically feel the smirk the man gave off. I suppose you could think of it that way, but like I said before, you have a tendency to ruin anything I try to set in motion. Having the Rinnegan, running from Konoha, those untraceable years where I thought you had simply vanished for good, collecting the biju, and unknowingly protecting the other Jinchuriki from the Akatsuki, even befriending Nagato. I've just come to consider you as one big wrench in the plans I lay down, enough that I've decided to deal with you myself. Naruto's eyes narrowed dangerously. This man was the cause of so much pain in his life. What makes you think you'll be any more successful than the last time you tried? The masked man reached for the gunbai on his back as Naruto lifted his hand threateningly, already circulating his agitated, anxious chakra. Gravity suddenly increased around the man, compacting the dusty earth and almost making him bend a knee. However, only a moment later he flexed his own hand and suddenly the pressure on his body vanished, making Naruto's eyes widen as his technique was cancelled out. You aren't the only one with that fancy Enemo dash, he was forced to cut off as Naruto got over his shock, swinging his arm up and launching a concentrated wave of gravitational force. However, that seemed to be just what the man was waiting for as he swung the gunbai, batting aside the Shinra Tensei like it was just any old jutsu, and only having his clothes ruffled for his trouble. At that very moment, though, two hands burst from the earth, or melded out of it would be more appropriate, and wrapped around Naruto's feet. Naruto managed to break away from one of the hands with his incredible strength, but it was just enough time for the masked man to dart forward at shinobi-worthy speeds and place his flat palm against Naruto's chest. At once a crippling pain surged through the monk, even as he stamped on the hand still restraining him to the ground. He tried to bring his shikuju around to strike Tobi, but the shinobi had already jumped back, a long tether of blue, glowing energy, tinged with a hint of orange, connecting his palm to Naruto's chest. Where he landed, another figure rose from the ground, a completely black figure that Naruto recognized from the descriptions of Zetsufu had given, although this one seemed whole and completely black. When he looked down, it was apparent this had been the one to restrain him, although how he had managed to sneak up on him was beyond him, at least until he saw the faint trace of natural energy surrounding the dark figure. I would thank you for finally allowing me to complete what has been over 4 decades in the making, but I understand you are somewhat of an unwilling piece in this board game. Instead, I'll give you the honor of witnessing the beginning of a world of true peace in the eternal Tsukuyomi. With that, Tobi wasted no time, before Naruto could recover, and even try to sever the chakra tether. A black rod Naruto recognized all too well slipped from his long sleeve, bound at one end to the ethereal rope. In a fluid movement, the masked shinobi threw the long black spear like a javelin, however not towards the blonde. The Gedamazu let out a long, continuous roar as the chakra-conductive pole impacted heavily with its chest, right above what appeared to be a small, round rock that was glowing with purple energy, and seemed to have been forcibly implanted into the beast's chest. Once again Naruto felt the terrible drain from where that cursed rope of light now connected him with the statue, even despite his Preta-path desperately trying to pull his chakra back. In the end he severed the chakra thread with a sweeping motion from his shikuju, grunting as he took an involuntary step back. It hadn't been an enormous drain of his reserves, but it was definitely noticeable. Plus, he didn't like the look of the statue now, writhing about as if in pain with long cracks splitting across its body. What did you do? The masked man turned to him, the glee visibly radiating from his body as he tore his attention away from the Jubi's shell to the now straightened monk. What are you talking about, Naruto Uzumaki? I did nothing. You were the one to provide the spark needed to finally awaken the Jubi from its long overdue slumber. Naruto's eyes widened at the implication before narrowing to dangerous slits as he glared at the man. What are you talking about? Now that his plan seemed to have come to fruition, the man seemed almost carefree about what he said, absently spinning the war fan in his hands. Did you think I would have no plan B, Uzumaki? I'm always prepared for every eventuality, even before I knew you were going around collecting the biju like festival prizes. His eyes narrowed as he gestured to the still writhing statue with the gunbai, obviously taking great pleasure in having to spell out his plan to the younger monk. The star of Hashigakure, the Zero Tails, and, with a little persuasion for our mutual snake friend, a seal designed to draw in nature chakra. Naruto suspected that was what the Mitsudomo mark across the creature's chest was. He certainly hadn't seen it in any of Nagato's memories. They provide the chakra, and you, my young monk, you provided the life essence. Suddenly Naruto's rinnegan widened in horror, the full realization of what had just happened crashing down on him, much to Tobi's obvious delight. Yes. I see you understand. Your chakra is merged with that of every single biju. You alone are the spark that is necessary to ignite the fire that will burn away this cursed reality. Suddenly Naruto was in motion, his body a blur and chakra surging through his limbs as he sprinted at the statue, hoping to be able to stop this somehow. However, Toby suddenly appeared in front of him, Warfan held out in front of him. Naruto's eyes narrowed as chains burst from his body, their silvery color enhanced by the moonlight above them. It's not going to be enough, Uzumaki. To Naruto's surprise, Toby was able to bat away each of the chains with ease, their sharpened, serrated points not even scratching the toughened gunbai. However, the blonde still used the distraction to get in close, rearing his fist back and molding his chakra. Unfortunately, before he could deliver a blow that would have separated the man's torso from, well, everything else, he simply passed through the man like he was a desert mirage. Now off balance, Toby swung round, viciously aiming the Warfan's edge at the monk's neck. It connected with a long, shining, serrated tail of folded metal and created a horrible grinding noise before Toby leapt back as a third arm that had appeared under the blonde's Hayori separated so that long metal tendrils from the fingers could lash out. They coiled around thin air though as Toby landed a few meters back, his posture still confident and at ease as he propped up the Warfan and leant against it. He watched in amusement as the extra arms whirred for a moment before disassembling itself back into the blonde's body, looking at his own hand in mock interest. I wonder if I could do that. Oh well, as amusing as this has been. No surprise registered on the man's face as a previously invisible Naruto suddenly pounced from behind him, two chakra rods aimed to pierce his heart and neck, only to phase right through and disappear with a puff of smoke as the man viciously backhanded it almost absently. But I really should be getting on with the main show, don't you think? Naruto tensed anxiously as once again Zetsu appeared from the ground, rising up as if it were water. For the first time Naruto noticed where Nagato's other Rinnegan had gone as he saw it implanted in the strange black creature's right eye socket. I don't profess to have the same mastery over this eye that you have, or even to the same degree Nagato had, but after observing him for so long I think I've gained enough of an innate understanding of one technique, at least. The man flashed through hand seals meticulously, making sure not even a single one was off before finishing on the snake seal. It obviously took some exertion to do so as the man's hands were trembling slightly and Naruto was racking his mind to try and come up with the technique he was about to use. Gedu, Rinne Tensei no Jutsu. Naruto's heart froze for a single moment as Toby slammed a glowing palm right into Black Zetsu's chest, making the strange creature double over. Slowly though its form began to shift, steam hissing off its body and ominously collecting about its form until it was completely concealed. Next to him, the masked man collapsed, having to use a hand to support himself against the ground as he panted heavily. However, after a moment or two a choked laugh escaped his throat as he looked up, the twin gleaming Dojutsu staring at Naruto with a glint of victory. It's amusing, isn't it? Normally I would introduce myself as Madara Uchiha. It helps strike fear into the hearts of those I face. Naruto tensed, trying to peer through the steam still rolling off Zetsu's form as Toby struggled back to his feet. However, considering what I just did, that seems a little redundant. Slowly the mist began to clear, blown away by some unseen wind to reveal the back of a man with long, spiky black hair. Aha! The sigh of utter contentment made everything freeze, the air, Naruto's breath, even the roaring of the Gedamazu seemed muted all of a sudden as the figure flexed their hand experimentally. The feeling of having a real, living body again. The voice was deep, commanding absolute respect and obedience with its very tone, and as the man turned, fixing the world in the sights of his single Rinnegan eye, Naruto saw why. The man was the real Madara Uchiha. Madara-sama. The Uchiha patriarch turned, looking down at the masked man with a raised eyebrow before noting the gunbai slung across his back. Obito? The masked man quickly nodded, removing the full head mask to reveal reasonably normal features, albeit with what appeared to be long-healed scarring across the right side of his face. A streak of white, no doubt from the use of the Rinnegan's most costly technique, ran through a head of short, spiky black hair. The plan has almost come to fruition, Madara-sama. The eternal Tsukuyomi is ready to be used. Madara simply nodded slowly, his one eye gradually roaming the barren, empty field he found himself in. It took in the full moon, the writhing, smoking form of the Getamazo, and finally looked at Naruto, his eyebrow only quirking at seeing another full set of functional, angry, Rinnegan eyes. "Where is that Nagato brat? I thought he would be the one to use the Rinne Tensei? And who is this?" The man, identified now as Obito, not that the name meant anything to the young monk, made to answer only for Madara to think better of the questions. "On second thought, I require a test of my abilities anyway." Before the confused Obito could even comment, he suddenly found his head in the strong grasp of his mentor. "Ninjutsu." Obito's eyes widened impossibly as a loud, strangled scream erupted from his throat, his pupils twitching about uselessly as his whole body convulsed. When Madara finally released him, it was as a crumpled heap, the strength left in his body after resurrecting the ancient Uchiha finally leaving him all at once. Madara closed his eyes for just a moment before a small smile broke out over his face. "Another Rinnegan wielder? That's interesting. I wonder how that came about when I was supposed to be the only true successor to the sage." The man regarded Naruto for a long few moments, where Naruto found himself paralyzed in that searching, commanding gaze. This man, the aura he simply radiated, it was like nothing he had ever faced, not even in Nagato. "Perhaps my absence from the world prompted some kind of reincarnation. No matter, you and the remaining chakra of the biju you hold will be dealt with in time." He turned, almost negligently, back towards his crumpled student, looking to retrieve the last of his eyes. Moments later though, and his arm snapped up, creating a wall of gravitational energy to cancel out the one that had suddenly been thrown at him. "I will stop you." He turned, a look of actual amusement in his eye as he regarded the young blonde standing defiantly in front of him, Haori blowing in the breeze and Shikuju held confidently in hand. Slowly Madara crossed his arms in front of his chest, over the red samurai-esque armor he was famous for wearing both in his prime during the clan era, and after his defection from the very village he helped to create. "Really? A mere boy standing in front of someone like me? You may possess the Rinnegan, child, but do not presume to think that places you in the same realm as myself." Naruto's hand tightened around the Shikuju in his hand to the point his knuckles turned white. "But if you insist on dancing, at least make me take the first steps." Faster than Naruto could see, he literally couldn't see the Uchiha's hands move, they were so fast. Madara ran through hand seals before holding one up to his mouth. "Katon, Goka Mekyaku." Uchiha were renowned for two things, the Sharingan and their strong affinities for fire jutsu. However, as Naruto saw the veritable tidal wave of flames that were suddenly bearing down on him, he had to be reminded this was a man and not the vengeful form of Amaterasu herself. Knowing that even with the Preta path, he would likely suffer severe burns if he tried to absorb this conflagration, he lifted his hands to his mouth and rapidly molded his own chakra. Suiton. The deluge of water he sprayed out wasn't just a veritable tidal wave, it was a literal tsunami. It was far less refined than an actual jutsu, but with the elemental advantage it managed to overpower the absurdly strong technique, leaving the area blanketed in a sudden veil of steam. However, barely a second later Madara burst from that steam, flying through the air with his reclaimed gunbai in hand as he moved to swat Naruto aside like some irritable insect. It was all Naruto could do not to get his body crushed as he leapt to the side, chains bursting from his body to keep the powerful Uchiha at bay. Gakudo. However, as soon as the chakra constructs came close to the man, he was surrounded by a small corona of light that absorbed the chains as soon as they made contact, taking a good chunk of Naruto's chakra with them. He withdrew them instantly only for Madara to grab one of them, a vicious grin on his face that would have better suited the Kyuubi as he yanked hard. Blood erupted from the younger blonde's mouth as Madara's fist firmly planted itself in his stomach, making him crumple around the limb before being crushed into the ground with a brutal display of power. Pitiful, and Obito was having such trouble with a weakling like you? Naruto lay there in the crater his body had formed, his eyes wide and unblinking as Madara set a foot atop his chest. "You're hardly even worth the effort, not even a shinobi." Madara drove down, making Naruto cry out in pain again as the crater was deepened and another arc of blood erupted from his lips. Shame, I had been so looking forward to a good fight once I was brought back. All I get is dash the man's lone Rinnegan. I whitened for just a moment as he brought down his foot for another stomp only to be bodily swatted aside by tendril of sand the thickness of the Achibi's tail. Is father okay? The timid, questioning voice rang out in his head as Naruto lay there, staring up at the starry sky with a body racked with pain. Slowly he brought a hand up before slamming it into the ground next to him, digging his fingers into the broken earth and pushing himself up. I'm fine, Shikaku, thank you. He got no reply except a faint feeling of happiness that seemed to ease some of the pain in his ribs. At that moment he reminded himself that it was not just himself on the line here. He was fighting for everything he cared for and believed in, the biju, Fu, Nagato and Konan, his friends, the monks, and they were all counting on him. Ah, you finally seem to have gained some resolve. A shame it was too late. Madara's mocking voice echoed around the shattered battlefield as Naruto noticed something very strange. It was very quiet all of a sudden. The Gedemazu's almost constant cries that the blonde had tuned out had stopped, and when he looked around a great shadow descended over the field. At that moment Naruto truly felt like an ant as he stared up into the nine-tomo eye of the Jubi. And it stared right back at him. Chapter 90, Blood 4. For an awful, incredible moment, time seemed to stand still. A deafening silence washed over the tiny monk as he locked eyes with the titanic creature crouched before him. Words did little to describe the sheer size of the monolith, towering far above the Kyubi in scale. It seemed even more daunting with the waves of unrepressed power rolling off its form, incomparable to anything Naruto had ever tried to comprehend. It was like he was a mere child again, staring into that rubbing of a simple wood carving and wondering how any man, no matter how powerful, could stand against a monster like that. And it was a monster, there was no mistaking that. With its thick, pallid white skin and grotesque spindly body, it gave it the appearance of some comically oversized insect, hunched over its minuscule prey. A strange, almost plant-like bulb hung off its back, seemingly disproportionate to its thin, lithe frame, but only adding to its comical appearance. If only the blonde could find it in him to see this as comical. Instead, he was locked into the gaze of that single, bulbous, blood-red eye with 9 swirling tomo, like little black koi in a crimson pond, unable to move as it regarded him with a bestial intelligence. Then the eye narrowed, as if in recognition. Even Madara seemed shocked by the ear-splitting roar the creature gave as it howled into the night sky, the sheer magnitude of the blood-curdling cry causing the ground to shake. 10 great bone-white tails writhed behind the Jubi, thrashing and contorting as they finally found their independence once again. One thin, desiccated arm raised up, great trails of dust following the titanic limb in its long arc through the air. It crashed back down like a natural disaster given intelligence, a tsunami of earth and debris hurtling across the barren plain. It was enough to finally snap Naruto back into reality. The seemingly unbreakable staring match between the Rinnegan and the Jubi snapped like a tennis tether by the wall of earth and soil taller than any building Naruto had ever seen. His hands snapped up on instinct as he was cocooned by a sphere of intense gravitational energy that split the oncoming wave like it was just water and not tons upon tons of stone and earth. When the dust finally settled, he found he could once again see the monstrosity the Gedemazu had become. It seemed displeased he wasn't dead. Naruto seemed slightly confused though as a tiny black dot alighted on the beast's head, his eyes widening when he realized it was Madara. The beast didn't seem to agree with his presence there, thrashing wildly in movements that could have rent mountain apart. Its tails, each tipped with short stubby hands of 5 fingers, tried to grasp the man and throw him away, while stick-like limbs tipped with vicious claws scrabbled at a grotesque, undefined face to rid itself of the tiny infestation. However, Madara managed to bat the mighty limbs with bursts of gravity and swings of his seemingly impenetrable gunbai, once again snapping Naruto out of his daze. For a moment he fought with himself, attempting to shrug off the monumental energy the beast released and focusing on himself, using the moment of reprieve to his advantage. He stilled himself, focused on his breathing and his heart as he sunk to the ground, tapping into the unbound energy of nature that was all around him. As he drew in the senjutsu, a feeling of peace washed over him, blowing away the unease as powerful, but harmonic energies intertwined with his own. When his eyes opened again, they burned a molten gold, and the fear he had felt under the Jubi's immeasurable presence had abated. At least enough that he wasn't petrified in place. Those same golden eyes widened a moment later as he leapt out of the way of a descending bone-white tail, performing a feat of acrobatics his body had been incapable of not even a few seconds before. The shockwave of displaced air the gigantic impact created wasn't enough to throw him away as he twisted his body and recoiled off yet another tail that had been sent to crush him flat. This time though, silvery chains burst from his body, the senjutsu-enhanced serrated tips burying themselves deep into the beast's tail, much to its obvious displeasure if the second ear-shattering roar was anything to go on. As the tail slammed into the ground, Naruto managed to place himself in quite possibly the most idiotic and ill-fated position he could have, right beneath it. For just a moment the Jubi seemed to ignore Madara's presence on its head, its lone red eyes flicking over to where it felt the familiar, sage-enhanced presence underneath one of its tails. Had anyone been in tune with the creature's bestial emotions, they would have felt the immense satisfaction that rippled through its primitive mind. At that moment Madara started racing through hand seals, only to be paused as the Jubi's entire body shook, and its single bloody eye widened in shock. Naruto groaned lightly, the weight of the tail and the strain the impact it had with the ground really doing a number on even his durable body. However, a moment later he sucked in a deep breath, gritted his teeth and grunted with incredible exertion as his fingers, temporarily deconstructed into knife-like appendages, dug into the beast's flesh, giving him enough grip for the foolish, idiotic thing he was about to try. For just a moment, as his muscles strained and his eyes glowed with pure determination, he wondered what Tsunade would think if she could see how recklessly her technique is being used. He cast the thought aside though as he diverted all his concentration into lifting the Jubi. Grah! His body trembled as the earth below him cracked, the combination of the strength technique, the natural body enhancement the Rinnegan gave and Naruto's own senjutsu-empowered strength dragging the tail up and off of him, but not stopping there. Madara's own Rinnegan eye widened in both surprise and amazement as, by a single tail, the Jubi's body lurched into the air. It followed an impossible flight path as it flailed madly, suddenly not in control of its own movement, but that only lasted a moment before it bodily crashed into the earth again. Hundreds of kilometers away, people in Iwagakure and Sunagakure alike felt the tremors from the impact, noting it down as a mild earthquake. Somewhere around where the Jubi's head was now implanted into the earth a large pile of rubble burst outward in a spray of small boulders. A mildly irritated Madara pulled himself out of the earth, having jumped off the beast before he could be crushed beneath its weight only to get pulled into the resulting wave of debris from the fall. He brushed the light smattering of dirt he had accumulated off of his armor, his eye narrowed in annoyance as he glanced about. Uzumaki, if it isn't Senju it's Uzumaki. Why do those families always have to get in my dash? The tall Uchiha couldn't finish his thought though as his hand suddenly snapped up, causing him to grunt as a wall of displaced air rushed over him. When he looked around, he saw that the object he caught was actually Naruto's foot, the monk having launched himself toward the Uchiha patriarch while he was seemingly distracted. HMPF, that almost hurt. However, his one Rinnegan eye widened slightly before a smirk rolled over his features, amused by what he saw flashing in the young Uzumaki's eyes. Sage mode? Now that's interesting. His smirk slipped a little when he saw Naruto's own smile flash over the blonde's face. It's not the only thing. Madara grunted as his entire body was flung backwards, the blonde he had caught dissipating into clean white smoke. He slammed bodily into the side of the Jubi's head as the great beast began to stir, lifting its titanic body out of the oddly shaped crater it had made. He stuck to the side of the creature with chakra, only to suddenly stop the flow to his feet and drop away as Naruto descended from above, slamming the heel of his foot into the spot he had moments before occupied. Once again the Jubi cried out in anger and pain as its head was once again crushed into the crater by the unbelievable force the comparatively tiny blonde could create. Madara watched the monk pick himself up after the failed axe kick with an appraising eye, noting his form and power with a gaze that had seen him through countless life and death battles in his youth. The Uzumaki's strength was tremendous and his speed, at least now he had entered a senjutsu state, was nothing to sneer at. There was also the small fact that the blonde had both of his eyes while Madara was working at the disadvantage of lacking depth perception and many of the Rinnegan's techniques. It was made worse by the fact he seemed to have lost Obito's unconscious body somewhere in all the confusion. He severely hoped it had not been pulverized beneath the beast. Sand suddenly began to swirl around the Uchiha, but he extended a hand and blasted it all back with an overpowered Shinra Tensei that immediately cleared the area, also blasting back the 4 clones that had been waiting within the sandstorm to attack, a tactic he approved of. The Jubi was stirring again and Madara wasted no time flashing across the distance, his body barely appearing as a flicker before he was atop its head. Naruto also appeared a few meters away, already in full sprint, however, as he got closer time seemed to slow down. He caught it in perfect clarity as Madara smirked, his head turned just enough that Naruto could watch with widening eyes as the single Rinnegan morphed into some strange red and black pattern. Susanoo. The breath left Naruto's body rather violently as his entire body was suddenly flung to the side, as if he were some insects hit with the back of some giant's hand. His head went fuzzy from the massive impact, but he had enough sense that 3 thick chains burst from his body, allowing him to swing back down and crash into the side of the Jubi's slowly rising head. If it had been any normal surface, he likely would have cratered it. As it was, the Tentail's head simply swayed a bit to the side, its tails thrashing about in its anger. "Don't you see the futility of all this now, Uzumaki?" As the blonde ran up the side of the beast's head he paused, Madara's voice, and the sight before him making him slow, and then stop. "The infinite Tsukuyomi is the only answer to humanity's suffering. In it every person would have their perfect world." The Uchiha was now enshrouded by a monolithic 4-armed creature of translucent blue flame, resembling some of the old pictures Naruto had seen of samurai, only covered up by a similar blue cloak leaving just its 2 glowing yellow eyes visible far above the stoic Uchiha's form. He realized what had hit him when he saw 2 of the arms grasped massive statue-proportioned swords. The other hands were clasped into a tiger seal in front of its body. "It's just a lie, an illusion." Naruto struggled to keep his footing as the Jubi once again reared up, its eyes flicking about madly as it searched blindly for the 2 humans fighting atop it. Madara seemed unfazed as he smirked easily, arms crossing over his chest as the monolithic blue creature he had summoned leered down ominously, glowing yellow eyes peering at the younger blonde as if searching for something. "And this reality is not? All of this is some greater illusion, meant to enslave humanity to its baser, darker whims. In a genjutsu you see, hear and feel whatever the caster wants you to, and yet it is no less real than this pitiful existence because your mind perceives it as such." Madara's words were nearly drowned out under the intense growling of the creature they stood on top of. As its tail swept by, great winds ripped at their clothing and made the flames decorating the Susanoo sway. Peace attained through this kind of force is worthless, not even worth having. At that Madara's expression finally seemed to darken, a snarl briefly passing over a normally smirking mouth. "And what would a child like you know? Are you so selfish as to deny mankind the peace it has been searching for when you stand on top of its answer?" His face reset itself into a mask of indifference as the sword-bearing arms of his Susanoo tensed. "In that case, I will force you into that world myself. Only my power will show you that you are wrong." Suddenly, faster than its great size would deceive you into believing was possible, the Susanoo swung down with its pair of swords right at the young blonde. There was stillness for a moment before far off in the distance a mountain suddenly exploded, the sheer pressure of the winds displaced by the enormous blades enough to cleave it in two. However, as Madara peered through the dust, the attack had picked up. A frown crossed his features as all he heard was a small chuckle, almost lost amidst the Jubi's movements. What was that supposed to do? Naruto walked out of the small cloud of dust, not even remotely injured or seemingly bothered by the normally unstoppable attack. Attacking a Rinnegan user with a giant constructive chakra? The blonde actually seemed a little incredulous as he walked forward, causing Madara to scowl as the Susanoo swung its other sword, aiming to bisect the irritating monk through the middle. However, as the glowing blue blade touched the Uzumaki, it just seemed to pass right through him, however the tug Madara felt on his chakra reserves told him exactly what had happened. The blonde had just absorbed it. It took a moment for the Uchiha patriarch to process that his Susanoo, the strongest technique offered by the Mangekyo Sharingan, for the longest time his strongest technique, was completely useless against this mere boy. Once it did, his skull only deepened as the lumbering chakra construct faded away. Before he could retaliate, though, both Rinnegan users were forced to dive to the side before one of the Jubi's long tails scraped across its scalp, attempting to dislodge the pair. As Madara clung to the side of the beast's head, he realized something that deeply unsettled him. He was actually at a disadvantage here. Naturally, the man did the only thing he could in a situation like that. He began running through a chain of hand seals. A long chain of hand seals. Naruto had ended up in the worst position, further down the Jubi's long spindly back, close to the plant-like bulb it carried. He was currently dodging its vehement attempts to get him off, namely by slamming its own tails all over its body, until it felt something squish. His senjutsu-enhanced speed and the naturally lumbering movements of such a large creature were enough for him to dodge for now, but he wasn't sure how long he could keep it up, and the Jubi was offering him no avenues of escape. However, after a few moments of this intense dodging, it didn't seem to matter anymore, as the Jubi's tail suddenly stilled, twitching lightly in the air as the beast gave out one long guttural roar. Then, suddenly, it went quiet, the roar replaced by a strange sucking sound as the flesh beneath the blonde's feet warped and twisted. His eyes widened when the ground was suddenly wrenched from beneath him, and he was falling, buffeted on all sides by powerful winds created by the powerful vacuum that had been where the Jubi was once standing. He twisted to land softly on his feet, only to nearly drop his Shikuju in shock, Rinnegan eyes going wide. The Jubi was gone. Just like that, the enormous beast that moments ago Naruto couldn't even comprehend had just vanished, leaving just a cloud of dust and smoke in its wake. However, it quickly became apparent that wasn't quite true, as the overbearing presence the great beast had given off was still there, stronger even, as if it had been concentrated. The full implication of that thought didn't quite sink in until the smoke began to clear and Naruto managed to make out a distinct figure hanging in their air, just a silhouette against the full moon. It was Madara, but at the same time it wasn't. His hair that had previously been a deep raven black was now a startling white. Instead of his rustic armor, he was now covered in a brilliant snowy cloak that had a distinctive pattern on the back of 9 tomo arranged in a square headed by a Rinnegan pattern. He had donned a headband that seemed to grow out of his scalp, similar to Naruto's in that it had horns, only lopsided with the larger horn over the Rinnegan eye he had. As if to complete the look, and to mock Naruto at the same time, he now held a long black Shikuju in his outstretched hand, similar in appearance to how Naruto's chains had initially looked, a black so deep it was like looking into a starless night sky. This is power. Madara's voice seemed to reverberate around the area, not having particularly changed, just sounding more commanding. The man flexed his hand as the air seemed to quiver at his almost absent ministrations. The dark Shikuju in his hand seemed to bubble slightly as equally black spheres of what Naruto could only assume was chakra bloomed along its surface before being released to orbit the man's body. Despite knowing it was chakra, and seeing it was such with his own Rinnegan, something told Naruto that he did not want to try and absorb those spheres. He couldn't be sure why, just an unsettling gut feeling they gave off. His suspicions were only strengthened when Madara's vision suddenly snapped towards him, his lone Rinnegan eye regarding him with mirth. The idea of it seemed absurd, but with his new appearance seemed to come a mild change in personality as the man grinned slightly. Suddenly, and luckily still within Naruto's ability to perceive things, one of the dark spheres shot towards him, elongating slightly with the sudden shift in direction and speed. Shinra Tensei. Naruto's hand shot up, but the sphere sped right towards him all the same, shearing through the wall of gravitational force like it was just a light breeze. The blonde flinched as the sphere got within a few meters of him, only for a wall of sand to interpose between the two. Uncaring for what exactly just happened and thankful that the sand seemed to at least slow the sphere if not stop it, Naruto threw himself bodily to the side. He watched from the corner of his eye as the black substance sheared right into the ground where he had stood, passing through like it was air and not slowing for a second. Another, thicker wall of sand appeared behind him as a second sphere tried to sneak up on him. For some reason, even with his senjutsu-enhanced senses, he couldn't feel this strange, unnatural substance's presence. He was just glad that for whatever reason the spheres seemed to be slowed by the sand, even if it didn't take them all that long to pass through anyway. Shikaku will always protect father. Naruto was a little surprised by Shikaku's happy voice suddenly speaking up in his mind, although he didn't let it show as chains ripped from his side to pull him out of the way of another black sphere. Shikaku is right, Naruto. Madara has become far more powerful. You will have to rely on us if you want to have any hope of defeating him. This time it was Kurama's voice cutting in, and the thought made Naruto frown slightly as he shot off a blast of chakra from his reassembled arm. The sphere he was aiming at moved to avoid it, making Naruto smirk. If they had to avoid it, then there was a chance he could damage them. However, he was so caught up on this sudden revelation, he was just unprepared for Madara to suddenly appear in front of him, dark Shikuju raised and an amused smirk on his face. You just continue to amuse me, Uzumaki, trying even when you must know it is hopeless. His short monologue was the only thing that gave the blonde time to lift his Shikuju, holding it up in front of his as the two monk staffs met. Madara's strength was monstrous though, and Naruto could feel the ground beneath him cratering from the sheer force the Jubi Jinchuriki was placing on him. However, that was the least of his worries as he noticed a tiny crack begin to appear where the two staffs were touching, and it wasn't on Madara's. There was nothing he could do except watch as the crack grew and sync with Madara's grin until, with a noise oddly reminiscent of a tolling bell, the Shikuju snapped. Time slowed immeasurably as Naruto felt his feet leave the ground, watching as the two halves of the staff he had carried for 6 years, the staff that had seen him through his adventures and had almost become as much a part of him as his own arms, just broke. There was no explosion of energy or terrible noise. The simple wooden stick snapped as wood was bound to do, with a few splinters flying out. Then time snapped back into place and Naruto was sent hurtling back, only having the sense to twist his body at the last moment and grab the ground to right himself, skidding to a stop in a 3-point stance. He watched as Madara stood on the ringed half of the broken Shikuju, cracking it further with a grin. There will be no need for useless relics of a forgotten age in the infinite Tsukuyomi. Suddenly reservations about using his tenant's power seemed trivial, the previous stalwart reasons he had avoided tapping into that immense well of power becoming forgotten as he looked at that man's smirking face. The air around Naruto began to ripple and contort as a visible nimbus of light began to shroud his body, a single tail rising up before shrinking back down. Madara was able to see with perfect clarity as a single tomo appeared in the outermost ring of Naruto's Rinnegan, at least until the entire area they were standing in became shrouded in shadow. The newly awakened Jinchuriki of the Jubi looked up with moderately widened eyes as enormous pillars of sand, that were slowly taking on the appearance of arms, rose high into the sky. They were comparable to the Jubi's arms themselves, although thicker, and with blue vein-like patterns crisscrossing the construct's surface. That was all he got time to admire before they suddenly swung down, buffeting the area with shockwaves of wind. However, Madara just lazily raised his hand, watching as one of the black spheres rose up and stretched out into a thin but wide shield. There was a deafening boom and a rush of air, and when the smoke cleared it was obvious the sand had done nothing against the dark shield. However, when Madara looked over to where Naruto had stood, he only saw a few wisps of aimless sand. He batted the chains that suddenly appeared to the side with ease, catching a kick with his knee, and the following scissor with the tip of his Shikuju. But as he moved to bat the irritating blonde away, tens of spikes of sand snapped out of the ground, easily blocked by a hasty shield of the black substance, but a little too close for comfort. Then Naruto was on him again, twisting his body to lash out with hands that suddenly seemed to be wreathed with virulent blue flames. Madara's visual prowess was able to catch a second tomo enter that outermost ring in his eye before he was forced to move his head out of the way of a lightning-fast strike aimed for his eye. Naruto was suddenly faster, and while Madara still considered it hardly within his realm of concern as he easily moved out of the way of each precise strike, it was moderately disconcerting. He could feel the heat from the unnatural flames licking at the boy's hands, fingers curled to resemble claws, as well as his feet. You can trust in us, Naruto, like you managed to make us trust in you. Matatabi's dulcet tones drifted through the boy's mind, only spurring him on as he struck faster, stronger, and with more determination. However, as Madara continued to backpedal and shift his weight, he quickly grew irritated with the small bout of taijutsu, suddenly bringing the Shikuju-bearing hand up faster than he had before, a long streak of the black substance flowing out of the end that quickly whipped around, catching Naruto under the ribs. Madara grinned as he glanced along the trench Naruto had made with his body, as he skidded across the ground like a tossed-aside ragdoll. However, the grin wavered slightly when the dust settled to reveal the blonde cocooned in a strangely organic red shell that slowly crumbed apart to reveal it was coral, as well as a third tomo entering his eye. We're just returning the favor for protecting us for so long. Naruto's hard gaze softened slightly at Isabu's gentle prompting, a glint alighting in his eye as he took a step forward before breaking out into a sprint. Madara sent more black spheres at him, but they were either partially blocked by walls of sand or gracefully flipped over as Naruto descended to running on all fours, his hands and feet still bathed in iridescent blue fire. Show him that the biju aren't to be underestimated. A vicious grin that wasn't entirely his own spread over Naruto's features as he got in close to Madara, Son Goku's words echoing in his mind as he absently raised his hand to cancel out a powerful Shinra Tensei and barreled through the resulting aftershock, the heat around his limbs suddenly intensifying tenfold. A large wall of the dark chakra blocked his path, but Naruto just clawed his hands in front of his chest in a sweeping motion, a great limb of sand shooting up out of the ground to copy the motion. However, the blue markings had been replaced by burning orange lines of magma, like the veins of some ancient earthen golem. This time the black substance only barely held back against the assault. Even so, Madara had to drop it in favor of falling back as the spot beneath his feet suddenly erupted into a geyser of molten rock. Naruto leapt over the hastily collapsing shield, however was caught as Madara raised a hand, slamming his body right back into it. The blonde cried out in pain as he was crushed against the burning black chakra that he couldn't absorb for some reason. HMPF, I suppose you're better than going back to being a part of that thing. Naruto almost didn't hear Kokuo speak to him over his own cries, but he definitely noticed the steam that began to pour off his body in copious amounts. The pressure over his body fell away as Madara was forced to turn and shield himself from the scalding steam. The second tomo entering the middle ring in his eye went unnoticed behind the white smokescreen. However, Madara noticed it clear as day when Naruto leapt from the steam, raising his Shikuju to block a now much faster kick. I don't know how much help it'll be, but you're quite nice, like he was. Madara's eyes widened in shock as Naruto twisted his body unnaturally, in ways bones weren't meant to bend. That was nothing through compared to the shock as he noticed Naruto had somehow managed to stick his foot onto the Shikuju with chakra, and not only that, but the black substance seemed to just be melting away where the blonde touched it, as if it had been exposed to a powerful acid. All of a sudden Madara suddenly found himself quite hard-pressed against Naruto's increased speed and flexibility. The fact he had no discernible taijutsu style, and seemed completely random and unpredictable wasn't helping in the slightest. His eyes narrowed in anger as he allowed the black staff to disintegrate at the same moment an identical one formed in his offhand. He brought it up with a smirk of victory, crashing it into Naruto's stomach and causing the young monk to fold around the Shikuju before he wrenched it up with a powerful sweep. Naruto was sent hurtling upwards uncontrollably while Madara just grinned, crouching in a split second before blasting up after him. He reached the Uzumaki at the peak of his flight only to get sent flying back by what should have been an impossible kick, as Naruto contorted his body and lashed out with more strength and leverage than his position should have allowed. Do it for Fuchan, yeah. Chome called out excitedly as Madara ran a hand through his hair, allowing his body to hover in the sky. His eyes narrowed when he noticed the translucent white insectoid-esque wings sprouting from the blonde's back, and yet another tomo entering his eye, this time on the innermost ring. Some of Madara's irritation had begun to bleed away at this point, and for once he was actually thrilled with the way the fight was going. Far from the weakling Naruto had seemed to be, the young monk was proving to be a strong opponent and a worthy fight, even in his Jinchuriki-enhanced state. Already this confrontation was reworking the landscape with gaping craters and small rivers of lava. And for Kirabi, Ryuki's booming voice spoke softly as Madara flew towards them, a grin alighting on his lopsided features. It quickly turned into a look of disgust and irritation though as Naruto suddenly spun, using his newfound wings to rotate rapidly in a move he recalled from watching Foot Train, only with a modification. Bubbling, scalding black ink short in every direction from his spinning form, and despite Madara's attempts to put up a shield of the black chakra, some managed to cling to his robes, burning through it before the Uchiha expelled it with a sudden Shinra Tensei. Any enjoyment he had been getting from the fight evaporated in that moment as he felt as though his opponent was just mocking him. Naruto however, Kurama's words went unspoken as the air around Madara just seemed to explode outwards, a great rolling wave of air pressure managing to catch Naruto and sent him into an uncontrolled descent. Something about the wave seemed to destabilize the wings of chakra on his back, and Naruto suddenly found himself falling rapidly. A great plume of dust and debris shot up into the air where his body struck the ground. Enough of this. I have delayed long enough putting up with your pointless resistance because it was amusing, but it grows tiring now. Madara floated down to where Naruto was trying to pick himself up out of the surprisingly large crater his body had created. Again, Isabu's toughened coral had protected him, but he was still winded from the collision. At that moment though, it wouldn't have mattered if he was completely unharmed as Madara seemed to concentrate, raising his arm up and closing his eyes. Suddenly what looked like a long, writhing white root shot from his hand, flailing a moment before burrowing straight into the ground right where Naruto was getting up off his knees. He nearly fell over again though as the ground shook violently, thick branches and roots suddenly bursting up at random all around him. Madara closed his hand and cut off the connection with the roots, however they still grew and writhed without his supervision. The Uchiha Patriarch simply glanced down into the crater as more and more roots sprang up, twining around one another and around Naruto, as well his face only showed a cool, collected victory. Now, be swallowed by the Shinju as you join the infinite Tsukuyomi. Chapter 91, Blood v. Madara's words were lost on Naruto as he dove backwards, narrowly avoiding getting ensnared by a large white root that had suddenly burst from the ground beneath him. His eyes were wide and slightly panicking, as he was forced to duck low as a wooden tentacle tried to wrap around his neck. Out of the corner of his eye he could see Madara smirking at him, hovering a safe distance away from the rapidly growing, whatever it was he had released. The name Shinju sounded particularly ominous. As he watched the sky become eclipsed by twining and creeping branches and roots, it really was comparable to some godly tree bursting from the earth to reach towards the heavens. His arms whirred with activity as one deconstructed before reforming into a whirring saw that slashed madly, cutting the thick wood before it could get too close. The insectoid wings on his back that had managed to reform buzzed madly as his eyes flicked about, searching for any opening in the rapidly closing maze of wood and plant life growing around him. Every touch from his body seemed to melt away at the twining branches, but for every one he destroyed 5 more seemed to take its place, writhing and contorting about as the blindly sought him out. He gasped in shock as a smaller, thinner wooden root suddenly wrapped around his arm like a whip. Almost instantly the blue glow pervading his body dissipated, leaving him breathless and drained. His eyes only shot open wider as his struggles grew in intensity, realizing that whatever this plant was, it was desperately trying to absorb his chakra. However, for all his struggling, the tree continued to grow and more roots took up the few precious remaining pockets of space left. Another branch snagged his foot, and he quickly sawed it away only to have that arm jerked back as a wooden tentacle snaked around his wrist. He panted furiously, muscles bulging against his various restraints as he felt his vision beginning to blur. The space around him was getting darker and darker as the roots grew over the last few gaps, letting moonlight in. His body felt so weak as he sluggishly wrenched his way out of the Shinju's wooden grip only to be ensnared twice as strongly moments later. Even through the darkness that was slowly encroaching on his vision, the young blonde managed to catch a final glimpse of Madara's Rinnegan eye glinting with victory before a last root grew over that too with a shuddering, creaking groan that rang with finality. His struggles grew less powerful, his movements lacking energy as his eyes were beginning to droop dangerously as the last vestiges of his chakra were whittled away. He just felt so tired, closing his eyes, and allowing that inviting darkness to swallow him up seemed so comfortable. Naruto's head nodded down, his eyes slowly closing, unconsciousness gently tugging at his awareness. Naruto. Cheyenne panted, her eyes wide and unseeing before she blinked, gulping in air, and trying to control her breathing. She had shot out of bed suddenly, her eyes showing an odd kaleidoscope of colors for a brief instant before returning to their normal violet hue. Her white shirt was soaked in sweat and clung to her skin, causing goosebumps to rise up along her delicate, pale arms as the cold night air chilled her. She sat there a moment, clutching worriedly at the collar of her shirt as she glanced about, her breath shallow and irregular, interspersed with slight gulps as she vainly tried to stop her heart from beating out her chest. Since Naruto had left Oni no Kuni, her visions had become few and far between, their land becoming relatively peaceful and quiet without the looming threat of Morio hanging over them like a storm cloud. However, it was unlike anything Cheyenne had ever felt before in her visions, a deep-seated, inexplicable terror that had surged up inside of her. Her dreams seemed vague and out of focus now that she was awake, but what had caused her fear was the terrible blood-red eye hanging in the sky, 9 obsidian tomo swimming through its crimson surface. Priestess. Predictably, Teruho threw open the sliding door to her room a moment later, by her side in a second as he checked her over. The young Miko brushed him off quickly though, composing herself as she absently straightened her hair, missing the gentle tinkling that her bell used to give off but smiling just a little as she thought about the young man she had given it to. "I am fine, Teruho, there's no need to worry." The attendant seemed unsure for a moment as he took in the young girl's disheveled appearance, but nonetheless bowed his head and left the room. Cheyenne stayed sitting there for a few more minutes, her eyes unnaturally drawn to the bright full moon hanging stoically in the sky. For just a moment she could have sworn it was interposed by that same bloody eye she had witnessed in her dream, but shrugged it off, only a slight chill passing down her spine to make her feel ill at ease. "Be safe, Naruto, please." Her mumbled words as she lay back down to sleep provided her little comfort though. "Gaara, what are you doing?" The young crimson-haired man shifted his teal eyes from his stargazing down to the teenager tiredly lifting her body up onto the tiled roof of the inn they were staying at for the night. "I couldn't sleep." His quiet voice did little to rouse the girl as she wiped at her eyes, a cute yawn escaping her lips as she slowly clambered up to roof to sit next to him, a little too close for them to be just casual friends. Oh. She didn't need to ask to know why. Gaara didn't often sleep, more from habit than anything else. Growing up while keeping Shikaku at bay, it had become more of a luxury than a necessity, and the russet-haired boy could often go weeks without needing even an hour of shut-eye. The two sat staring up at the star-filled sky for a few quiet moments. It was very clear out in the countryside of Cha no Kuni, and Sasame's tired eyes were drifting between the different constellations she could remember. "The moon seems too bright tonight." The orange-haired Fuma clan girl blinked before looking around at her friend in confusion. She had known ever since he rescued her those long years ago in Ta no Kuni that he had the penchant to be mysterious and vague, but she had come to accept that part of him. So much so that when he had finally decided to move on and refused even more of her clan's hospitality, she came with him. He hadn't seemed all that keen to have her along, but later on she realized it was just because he was unused to interaction with people as a whole. "You say the weirdest things sometimes, Gaara." The former Jinchuriki said nothing in return, but that was okay. Sasame had grown used to his long, quiet pauses, and had long ago stopped expecting answers when instead she could find them in his deep, teal eyes. She loved his eyes, often they were the only part of his body not covered in his sand armor, the only part that was really him. "You don't have to stay up for my sake, Sasame." That only made her smile more. Despite being the silent type she knew Gaara cared, he cared for all the bonds he had made since he left his home. She yawned as she shuffled closer, gently laying her head on his shoulder and smiling. "What kind of friend would I be if I let you stay up here all alone?" Yet despite those words her eyes fell closed a few minutes later, her breaths becoming slow and regular. Gaara just smiled, a small smile that was more the upturning of the edge of his lips, but it was a true smile. However, that smile vanished as a faint rustling broke the still quiet of the night. His eyes widened in surprise when he looked down to see the thin, but strong layer of sand almost permanently covering his body slip away. A moment of concentration and it had returned to its rightful place, but that one moment of wavering was enough to unsettle the former Sunanin. He hadn't had trouble controlling his sand for years, not since the Ichibi had been removed from him by Naruto, so why now? The question plagued him relentlessly. She stared back up at the moon, once again feeling the slight chill down his spine as it stoically stared back at him. His thoughts turned to Naruto, as they were sometimes wont to do, and he wondered what his first true friend was doing right now. The sand in his gourd stirred restlessly at the thought, doing nothing to settle his unease. Tsunade-sama, are you okay? Shizun tittered worriedly as she hovered about her mentor, a few sake bottles strewn about the booth they were sitting at. The restoration of the damaged section of Konoha had been going slowly, but most of the injured had been dealt with, and there were no life-threatening problems to deal with, so Tsunade had given herself a break. Namely, this involved going out to the nearest undamaged bar and drinking until she couldn't feel her toes anymore. However, on her fourth bottle of sake she had paused for a moment, staring down into her saucer quietly. "A what?" "Yeah, I'm fine, Shizun, stop being such a mother hen." Tsunade jerked up, the cup in her hand forgotten as she laughed at Shizun's irritated expression. The poor woman had only been trying to help after all. However, her features quickly turned pensive again, as she listlessly swirled the clear liquid in the saucer, until she couldn't see her reflection in it. "Okay, if you're sure." Shizun's tone echoed her own disbelief at the words. She figured Tsunade's recent bad mood had been from seeing Naruto and Fu again after all this time, only to have them leave without so much as a goodbye. She jerked though when the saucer in her mentor's hand suddenly cracked, breaking in two and splashing the older woman with sake, much to the enjoyment of the male patrons of the bar. As Tsunade cursed her misfortune, though Shizun couldn't help but stare at the little saucer, snapped clean in two, it was a very unnatural break and for some reason made her incredibly uneasy. "Oh, geez, Shizun, stop looking at the damn cup and get me a napkin or something. You stare like that any longer and you'll remind me of Sarutobi-sensei with all his bad omen nonsense." The younger woman was snapped out her daze and quickly moved to comply with her Shursho's request. However, she couldn't help but look back at the broken saucer, wondering why a chill had passed down her spine. Chikako coughed into his hand, his brow furrowing in exasperation as once again, he was forced out of his meditation on the whims of his feeble body. A sigh escaped his lips as he pulled his tired bones out of his cross-legged stance before cracking his neck. He was just becoming too old for all this, and it had begun to show with this recent cough he had picked up and couldn't get rid of. Chiriko had urged him to get it seen to, but he had shaken the man off. If it was his time, then it was his time, no use making some big fuss about it or drawing it out. He sighed though, knowing it wasn't quite true. He would like to see Naruto again if he could just hold out for that long. It was a selfish wish, but the old sentimental side of him would like to see the young boy that had considerably brightened up the temple with his mere presence. Still, he knew there was no use worrying over the thought, so he just smoothed out his robes and walked back over to the tatami mat he enjoyed meditating on the most. It was the spongiest. However, a frown marred his usually serene features when he noticed a small tear in the corner of the old mat, allowing another sight to escape his mouth as he shook his head. The temple was old, older than he was, and it too was beginning to show. That thought though elicited a small smile from the old monk as he fondly rubbed a hand along a wooden beam. "Gracefully growing old together, eh?" He chuckled, but it quickly descended into a small fit of coughs that had him holding onto the same beam for support until it subsided. "Well, maybe not so gracefully in my case." He let out a long breath, glancing up at the darkened sky he could see from his window. The moon was big and full tonight, normally excellent conditions for meditation and relaxation. All the same, Chikako just couldn't get into it. Something was just off. Sora allowed his head to flop back onto the cool ground with a welcome sigh, smiling lightly as he let his body be warmed by the invitingly crackling fire he had set up. The small clearing he had found was beautiful, with a clear little stream bubbling away to the side and dense patches of multicolored flowers strewn about in methodical chaos. He never once regretted his decision to travel away from the temple for a while. Already he had gotten to see sights he could have only ever dreamed of living with the monks. Just like his namesake, the sky was really the limit for him right now. So why did he feel so uneasy right now? For a few hours now, as he went about setting up his camp, and just generally relaxing, the strangest chill had worked its way into him. It was a warm night and the fire was lighting up the small clearing well, so he had trouble understanding where this unsettling feeling was coming from. He tried to put it out of his mind and thought instead about what he had seen on his travels, his hand naturally snaking up to fiddle with his Magatama earring as he often did when idle. Ah, damn it! He cursed lightly as the fragile ring that secured the small white bead to his ear snapped, immediately making his scrabble about in the grass until he found it. When he did, his eyes widened slightly, forcing him to hold it closer to the fire just to be sure of what he was seeing. Sure enough, as he turned the little white bead, he saw a tiny crack snake its way from the point all the way up the earring. A frown crossed the monk's face as his thoughts went to the one who had given him this as a gift, not exactly liking the bad omen it represented. Sajiri watched, entranced, as Shizuka flowed through movement after graceful movement of her latest kata. Her glossy black hair shimmered with each step and thrust in the light of the full moon bathing the training ground. He felt so privileged to be able to sit here and watch this epitome of grace and poise just move, even if they were in practiced movements designed to fight with. Naturally, his eyes were drawn to a single bead of sweat that percolated on her forehead, watching it trace the gentle curves of her face, down the taut slope of her neck where it rounded the swell of her bosom before finally disappearing into the alluring slit of her cleavage. Like what you see, Sajiri-kun? The boy's head shot up like lightning, a bright red blush spreading rapidly over the bridge of his nose as he desperately avoided looking into his girlfriend's mirth-filled emerald eyes. She had just finished her set, ending with implanting a few shuriken in a nearby tree in the vague pattern of a flower, only to glance up and see her boyfriend's wandering gaze. It was so fun to rile the poor merchant up, especially when he lacked the emotional training all Nadeshiko Kunoichi went through. I'll get those for you, Shizuka-chan. In a poorly concealed attempt to avoid looking at her, the boy quickly hurried over to the shuriken implanted in the tree, taking them out one by one. He jumped then when he felt a hand lightly caress his neck, turning with a more brilliant blush to see Shizuka right behind him, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Gently she took the shuriken Sajiri had in his hand, just enjoying the fact that she could share this time with him. It reminded her to thank Naruto the next time she saw him. Ah. Sajiri pulled his hand back, a bead of red welling up on his fingertip from where the shuriken, that had inexplicably shattered into two between their grip, had cut into him. Shizuka just raised a brow. She hadn't thrown the shuriken nearly hard enough to leave them this brittle, and they were only a few days old. Oh, come here, Sajiri-kun, let me help you with that. Never one to let an opportunity drop, though, Shizuka quickly took the merchant's finger from where he was cradling it and leading it up to her mouth where, after only a moment to smirk mysteriously at her lover, she placed it between her lips, sucking slowly. As Sajiri, now properly motivated by the entrancing display, led the giggling Kunoichi from the training ground, she spared another fleeting glance to the shuriken laying abandoned on the grass. A single bead of crimson blood lay on the cold steel, catching the reflection of the moon but dyeing it a sickly, unnatural scarlet. It went quickly forgotten though as the young woman turned her attention back towards the man she loved, only existing as a slight chill that only briefly passed down her spine. Nezumiro cracked her back softly as she finally made it up the slope, silently complaining about where Naruto had to place Shizuka's grave. However, soon enough the beautiful statue he had made of the girl came into sight, making the amber-haired girl smile thoughtfully. Gently she placed the flowers she had collected down in front of the statue, her eyes following where the droplets of water actually seemed to leak down the girl's stony form. Sometimes when visiting the grave, she had to remind herself that it was just a statue. It often seemed so lifelike she would forget this wasn't actually Shizuka for a while. Today, though she wasn't sure, the statue seemed dulled. It was the only way she could describe it. It was as though it had lost some of the spark, the life that had made it so beautiful. After a moment or two of contemplation, the Kirigakure kunoichi shrugged absently. Maybe it was just the way the bright full moon hung overhead that seemed to bleach the statue of color, leaving it pallid and washed out. "Hey Shizuko-chan, it's a really pretty night, so I thought we could talk." Nezumiro grinned brightly as she sat down so she could lean against the base of the memorial, her legs pulled up tight against her chest. "Auntie May was really grouchy today. I think it's because of AO again, you know how he is." She wasn't sure how long she stayed out there, at least until the moon had inched further across the sky and dew had begun to collect on the grass. Some might have called her crazy for coming up to this desolate hill in the middle of nowhere and talking about inane things with a statue, but she enjoyed it. It gave her the opportunity to just talk and think without interruption, not to mention Shizuku, Fu, and Naruto had saved her life, and she felt she owed the girl who had given her life in her country's struggle for freedom. She always made sure to come up once at least every 2 weeks, to pay her respects if nothing else. Despite the statue always looking immaculate and never seeming to need any repair or maintenance, she didn't want the memorial to simply go forgotten. However, as the mists began to draw in for the inevitable morning fogs that plagues Mizu no Kuni, Nezumiro made her bright goodbye. She darted off from the statue, never noticing the condensation that built up around its sparkling stone eye, slowly sliding down its face like a single solitary tear. Hiruzen just knew his face must have gained a few years in the last couple days alone as he stood in front of the large panoramic window overlooking his battered, but surviving village. One of his arms was in a sling, and he had bandages crisscrossing his stomach, but his injuries were nothing he hadn't experienced through the 3 wars he had fought in or presided over. The wrinkles on his face seemed deeper, and his eyes were a little more sunken than usual, but most of all he felt tired, just exhausted. Watching as his village recovered yet again from attack, he realized just how old he was. Too long he had deceived himself that if Oanoki could stay strong in his old age, then why not him? The truth was he shouldn't even be standing here. He had long ago been ready to retire, give up the hat, and live out the rest of his life in relative peace with his remaining family. And yet, as he stood there, looking over the village he had helped shape and mold in his 60-plus years, he had no successor. His students, brilliant as they were in their own regards, had no intention of taking the mantle. The next generation were still too young even if they showed promise, and the current generation of Jounin just couldn't stand up to their predecessors in terms of power or ability, even if Kakashi came close. He sighed wearily, sinking into his comfortable chair and placing his fingers on the bridge of his nose. He often wondered how different things would be if Naruto had simply stayed in the village. In a few years he might have been ready to take up the Hokage title himself. He certainly showed the power for it if his ANBU's reports of the fight with the Akatsuki leader were anything to go on. Yet at the same time he couldn't help but feel ashamed about how happy Naruto seemed when he wasn't in the village, or when he was alone with that girl. What did that say about his treatment within the village for the short time he lived there? Another long-winded sigh escaped him as he looked towards the Hokage monument, always within view so that it seemed like the past Hokage were always watching over him, measuring what he did. In particular he stared up at the Yandame's face, wondering just how much he had failed his legacy. It had sustained a little damage in the fight with the Akatsuki, a few new cracks spidering out over his handsome stony features. Despite what his students might say, Sarutobi was hardly a superstitious man, yet as he looked up at that firm, stoic face carved into the mountainside, he felt a brief chill pass through his bones. Tayuya nearly spat out her drink, laughing raucously as Haku grinned, holding up a little ice sculpture of Anoka. The girl in question just huffed with slightly over-exaggerated irritation, crossing her arms under her chest and pouting. She wouldn't have minded normally. Haku's sculptures were often incredibly good, capturing the likeness of whatever it was he was copying down to the freckles. It was more the fact the little ice statue had her stood atop a pile of workmen, a whip in hand as she pointed somewhere in the distance. A few of the aforementioned workers caught sight of the little spectacle between the 3 teens and began laughing as well, quickly spreading to the entirety of the bar. Slowly the red-headed Uzumaki girl sank into her shirt, wanting to disappear as she was made the laughing stock of the entire room. Haku simply dissolved the statue and patted her on the back fondly, holding down his own chuckles. Anoka simply smirked evilly beneath the collar of her shirt. The ice boy would get his later. Never let it be said, and Uzumaki backed down in the face of pranking. Damn, I'm glad this was one of the first places they fixed up. Tayuya's slightly drunken tone washed over the three as she tipped back another saucer of sake, much to Haku's growing worry. Tayuya was usually quite a bit to handle without her being drunk, although he had to at least agree with her sentiment. The bar was a warm and lively place in comparison to the normally quiet and lonely ruins that otherwise occupied Yuzu no Kuni. Later on, figuring Tayuya had probably had enough, he bid Anoka farewell as he carried the other Uzumaki girl home on his back, trying not to wince as she sang to herself in her moderately tone-deaf slur, quite loudly. They passed a few workmen on the path back and Haku nodded politely, even as Tayuya jeered quite merrily. The workman had been a rather recent addition to the island, simply showing up one day around a few weeks ago for a reconstruction job. Apparently, someone had hired nearly the entire island of Nami no Kuni for the reconstruction of Uzushi-Ogakure. When asked how they were supposed to pay for such an undertaking, a kindly, but often drunken old man called Tazuna had told them it was all paid for by an anonymous donor. Haku instantly figured out who exactly had paid for it all, and at the time he had been rather disbelieving the young monk could possess such money. However, belief or not, the job had been taken, and ever since the Nami countryman had been there to stay, and slowly, but surely Uzushia was being restored to a semblance of its former glory. They didn't say anything, but Haku had a suspicion Anoka and Tayuya secretly hoped that as word spread about the rebuilding, the spread-out Uzumaki clan might once again come together in one home. It often amazed him how much family meant to those two once they realized they actually had some. Walking into one of the apartment blocks that had been set up as temporary living accommodation until more substantial housing could be built, he quickly unlocked his door, or at least attempted to, as a giggling Tayuya constantly batted away his hand, seeing as some kind of game. All the same, he eventually managed to make it inside before throwing Tayuya onto the bed, much to the girl's drunken joy. He ignored her sloppy, seductive calls from the bed as he got ready for the night, quietly smiling to himself from amusement. His girlfriend was a funny drunk. However, as he walked back into the bedroom, he noticed something off. Along the windowsill that he could clearly see the bright, full moon out of, were a row of small, immaculate ice sculptures. They were of each of his friends, including Fu and Naruto, the last two intended to be presents when the two finally returned to Uzushio. However, the figure of Naruto was cracked clean in half, a pool of melted water collecting around the two fragments. For a moment he wondered if Tayuya had knocked it over, but the girl had passed out in a rather undignified manner on the bed. It was easily fixable and shouldn't have really been a concern, but his eyes were drawn to the fact that with the way the figure seemed to be melting, it looked as though Naruto was crying. He tried to shake it off as he shifted Tayuya into a position that would actually allow him to get onto the bed, but try as he might he couldn't rid himself of the uneasy, unsettling feeling that came over him. The world around Naruto was dark and cold, like he had fallen beneath some frozen lake. His body was sluggish, unresponsive, and so very weak, it felt as though freezing iron chains held down his limbs. With every breath he heard his heart beat loudly in his ears, slowly getting slower and slower, like some petering lullaby allowing him to drift away. Where to he couldn't say, but right now, anywhere else seemed inviting and warm compared to this dark, freezing void he was trapped in. Oh. His breath quickened as he felt a gentle tug on his shoulder, his heart jumping in shock as it seemed to pull him back. He wanted to lean into the touch, but his body was so heavy, so cold that he just couldn't. He felt the warmth linger for a moment before that too disappeared, leaving him all alone again. Yuto. He felt it again, a tiny bit of warmth latching onto his shoulder, that he desperately tried to latch onto, frantically hoping that it would stay like a ray of light amidst a darkened storm. However, soon it slipped away like the last time, like some cruel taunt placed in front of him that his weighed-down body would never be able to reach. Aroto. Again, he struggled, forcing his tired, aching body to turn, to do something, so that the warmth wouldn't leave him. He couldn't take it again. A low, exerting grunt escaped him as he fought against his restraints with everything he had left. It wasn't enough though, it was like the weight of the entire world sat on his shoulders, it was just insurmountable. Naruto. If his head could have snapped up, it would have, as it was a pair of dim-lidded Rinnegan eyes managed to open, just a crack. Naruto, it's okay, you're not alone. Even this much was tough, but gradually he battled through it, opening his eyes, desperate to see who was talking, desperate to know who that warm, soft voice belonged to. It was so filled with warmth and compassion Naruto felt like the void was being pushed away by its mere presence. He had to know, had to. You were never alone. Naruto froze, his eyes fuzzy and half-lidded as he craned his neck against the roots securing him in place. He could barely make out a blur of long red hair before he blinked it away, the warmth that voice gave him pushing away the dark and the cold. Cold. A gentle smile, two bright, vibrant purple eyes, a mane of long, beautiful red hair. Her body was insubstantial, barely even there, like a ghost, and behind her there was a tall blonde man, his features strikingly familiar. Naruto couldn't know if it was delirium from chakra exhaustion, or just his mind going insane, but as he saw those two smiling softly at him, their eyes filled with pride, he saw others begin to appear behind them. Fu, Taiyuya, Haku, Shizuku, Nagato, Konan, Sora, Shizuka, Nezumiro, Chikaku, Chiriku, Sarutobi, Ayam, Tuchi. Everyone who had touched his life was standing there like wispy wraiths, smiling and urging him on with silent words. Another jolt of warmth ran through his body, filling him with energy he hadn't realized he even had, and when he struggles to turn his head again, he saw the biju, standing on his other side, their own eyes filled with determination. Kurama had laid a single great paw on his back, where the warmth seemed to be coming from. His breaths came out stronger as his eyes narrowed, the ground beneath his feet cratering as with a great cry of exertion he pushed. The roots seemed to writhe at his activity, but he didn't care. Even as they grabbed at his limbs and wrapped around his neck, he just pushed harder. More arms burst from his shoulders, pushing with him like the helping hand of comrades. His arms started to vibrate from the exertion, but even as he felt the muscles strain and begin to burn, he carried on, the people behind him slowly vanishing one by one until just those two remained, standing on either side, hands on his shoulders. We know you can do it, Naruto. We know you can do anything. The blonde's teeth clenched together as he roared out his pain and frustration, pushing with everything he had, with the strength he had been given. As Shinra. He never noticed a cloak of pure white chakra, with the consistency of a flame seemed to materialize out of the air to alight around his shoulders, a brilliant snowy haori that billowed out around him in an unseen wind. His eyes glowed brilliantly, 9 tomo spinning excitedly along their rings as he poured in every last ounce of energy he could feel in his body. 10 say. Then everything went white. Chapter 92, Blood 6. Madara floated far away from the Shinju, watching with mild curiosity as the strange, almost vine-like construction of the supposed god tree finished twining together with a final shuddering groan of wood. His eyes moved up to the top of the branchless tree where a large flower looked ready to bloom, a victorious smile passing over his features. He didn't really care if this over-glorified plant really was some kind of god. He was an Uchiha, he would harness its power regardless. No, what was important here was the fact that after decades of scheming, lying in the shadows out of sight of that damn Hashirama and his successors, his victory was finally upon him. The other Rinnegan user was dealt with, not that he ever stood a chance, not to mention the irritating Jinchuriki was trapped somewhere beneath the Ten-Tail's true body. His chakra would be absorbed and the god tree would be fully restored without the need for all of Obito's silly little modifications. The boy was talented and his Mangekyo was useful for sure, but he lacked the raw power needed to fully see his vision through. At that thought Madara frowned lightly, his eye morphing into its Sharingan form as it scanned the battlefield in search of his apprentice's body. He would be needing his other eye when. Responding to the sudden change, Madara's eye automatically flicked over the Shinju, as the entire tree suddenly shook with a tremendous force. Entire roots, longer than many villages were wide, were ripped from the ground and the Shinju itself swayed. He couldn't see it, but the eye nestled in that flower high above him widened in fear and shock as its petals shuddered with the unnatural force. It calmed moments later, but it left the Uchiha patriarch rather perturbed. Finally, though he put it up to the last futile struggles of a worthy adversary and left to look for his wayward pupil and his missing eye. A different set of Rinnegan eyes slowly opened to a very different scene as Naruto blearily stood up, or at least he thought he was standing. Wherever he was didn't seem to have a discernible floor. It just appeared to be a long, endless white void with no up or down, no ground or sky and not even a visible light source, although he could see his own hands just fine. It was all rather disorienting, and when he took a step forward, he was fearful he would just slip down into that bottomless nothing and be lost forever, falling, or maybe ascending. I assure you, this is a new experience for myself as well. Naruto whirled at the androgynous, monotone voice, his eyes wide and surprised. It had sounded as though it was right next to his ear. However, when he turned there was nobody there, further confusing him and causing him to slowly grow more frustrated. He took a breath, calming himself and sat down on the non-existent floor in a simple cross-legged position and focused on the flow of his chakra. It was the only thing in this white hell that was familiar and comfortable. Meditation, he was fond of that strange human practice also. Naruto opened his eyes, but was once again met by nothing but the empty space before him, no owner of the voice to be found. Then again, I find a great deal of what your race does to be strange. I suppose that is our differing natures. Naruto gently attempted to tap into the natural energy around him, hoping it would at least give him an inkling of where he was. However, as soon as he stilled his body, it was like opening the floodgates to an entire ocean. The area around him was completely swathed in natural energy. It blanketed this world like it was the air and the ground. What do you think you are doing? The voice still held a steady monotonous quality, but Naruto could feel the sheer hostility in those words as he desperately stemmed the flow of the senjutsu to his body before he was overwhelmed and consumed. Sorry. It came out on instinct as Naruto finally calmed the tumultuous energies within himself, letting the natural energy flow out of his body and back into this oddity of a world. Ah, so the human can speak, that is refreshing. Naruto sighed, knowing that wherever he was, meditation wasn't going to help him, nor deal with this voice that seemed to be speaking more within his head than actually to him. It is disconcerting to hold a conversation with nothing. Most people consider the behavior unusual. A presence finally made itself known behind the young blonde, but when he turned, he found words wouldn't come. He was transfixed, breathless. Ah, but what is unusual, Naruto Uzumaki? Before him stood a goddess. Other words failed to accurately sum up the presence this one woman had. She was tall, but only enough that Naruto had to slightly crane his neck to meet her eyes. They themselves were the purest white, almost like the Byakugan, save for where those clan members had the lightest hints of pale colors she had none, like she had no iris or pupil at all. His skin was equally pale, like a delicate porcelain that belied the rippling power she seemed to effortlessly emanate. Keeping with the pure theme, her hair billowed about her form like a blanket of snow, not a hair out of place even though it nearly reached her feet. In some places it seemed to merge right into the brilliant white cloak she wore, decorated in places by familiar symbols of Magatama and Tomo in vibrant, royal purples. Pale, almost unnoticeable circles decorated the space just above her eyes, not unlike the markings of a sage, while a vertical, slit-like line emerged just above the bridge of her nose. To complete the otherworldly look, two great horns rose from her scalp, parting her immaculate hair like a crown of smooth, perfect bone. Who are you? Naruto couldn't control the slight catch in his throat. However, he couldn't avert his eyes, or look away at all. This form is Kagaya Otsutsuki, the very first of your kind to partake of my fruit and live. In a way she was my very first Jinchuriki, the first to harness my power that you humans have come to corrupt and defile. At that, the meticulous expression on the woman's face twisted into a slight scowl, the sight of which Naruto could image preceded the destruction of a great deal of land. However, the word struck him as his mind flickered back to the stories Kurama had told him of the original sage when he had first begun to earn the fox's trust. Otsutsuki? As in Hagoromo Otsutsuki? Before his very eyes the visage of the woman shifted, the porcelain skin becoming sun-beaten and wrinkled, the hair losing its luster and becoming grayed, while the horns shrank down to more resemble Naruto's forehead protector. Then the eyes opened again and Naruto was facing down a very familiar set of rippled gray orbs as the Sage of the Six Paths hovered in front of him in a cross-legged stance so utterly familiar to him. It was the one Shikako had taught him all those years ago. There was him as well. He was certainly one of the more interesting of your kind with the way he disseminated my chakra amongst the people, hoping it would connect them together. A slight sneer crossed a face that looked as though it had never bore a negative emotion in its life. He was naive until the end, but he was strong. It was at that point Naruto snapped himself out of his mildly odd state and realized this wasn't actually the sage sitting in front of him, just an image, an echo. You are the Jubi then. The revelation surprised the blonde even as he spoke it. There was certainly no intelligence in the eye of that beast as he battled Madara atop its body. The representation of Hagoromo nodded all the same, a hand coming up to stroke the long, grayed beard. A distasteful and rather unoriginal name, but yes, that is an aspect of myself. More commonly, when I was still anchored in this world, I was known as the Shinju. Naruto blinked, remembering Madara say that very same name, as if it were supposed to be common knowledge. Why take this form then? The image of the sage tilted its head slightly, aged, omnipotent eyes regarding the blonde with something akin to curiosity. I could take any number of forms. Over the millennia hundreds have touched my chakra in one way or another, some housing my fragments. The sage's features shifted once more, suddenly flashing through many different appearances that Naruto didn't recognize until suddenly he saw Gaara's face, only to vanish moments later, replaced by Yujito's, Yagura's, then Rashi's and so on. The Shinju continued to cycle through the Jinchuriki Naruto knew, until it paused, and Naruto found himself looking into a much more familiar set of violet Rinnegan and bright blonde hair. Others housing a closer approximation to my whole. Naruto couldn't help the slight shudder that passed down his spine as he was forced to watch his own face morph into that of Madara Uchihas. It makes no difference to me, but as the very first I suppose I have an attachment of sorts to Kaguya. You humans might call it sentimentality. Slowly Madara's cruel features melted away, and Naruto was once again sitting across from the vision of beauty and power that was Kaguya Otsutsuki, now in a humble size of position. So, you don't consider it sentimental? Naruto wasn't even sure what he was saying anymore. The conversation had become so surreal. He was talking to the Jubi. Kaguya's eyes regarded him stoically though, a long pause following his statement. A long time ago I suppose I would not have. I was everything, connected to this world and so intrinsically linked that I never truly was. I existed, but I had no identity, no self, just a presence. However, with this woman's acceptance of my power I suddenly was something. I found a sense of self, separated from my whole. At that Naruto had a feeling the Shinju had once considered itself to be the entire world, although he could only infer. It grew within her son, an individuality that was so alien I initially fought it, refused to accept it. It was only when I was separated, fragmented that I realized what I had lost. Then those fragments gained their own sense of self, they grew further from our original whole, too far. The voice still carried no true emotion, but Naruto could almost feel the slight hint of longing lacing the air around him. New feelings I had before had no use for suddenly appeared, rage that something would take my energy, sadness that it could become tainted and twisted in such a way, fear as I was ripped from myself and imprisoned. Regret that I could not stop it. A long, uncomfortable silence seemed to ripple through the void as Naruto sat there, unknowing of what to say to this entity. You became more human. The representation looked up, not even a hint of emotion flickering across its face as its blank eyes bored into Naruto's soul for a moment. Yes. I became more human. Naruto was a little surprised it had accepted that so easily, only to feel a tremor of frustration ripple across the world around him. Then what now? Naruto had worked it out by now. Somehow, he had been drawn into some shared mind space with the Shinju. In retrospect he should have realized that if such a thing were possible with the biju then it only made sense for the same to be true of their progenitor. However, he didn't know how he ended up here. Was he dead? You are not dead, Naruto Uzumaki. The blonde blinked before frowning at the regal woman's impassive form. You're in my head. A slight tilt of the head gave the impression of amusement, but it seemed more of a facsimile, an imitation, than a genuine response. And you are in mine. However, that made the blonde's eyebrow raise slightly. It almost sounded like a joke, but that was impossible. You humans never cease to amaze me by what you decide is or is not impossible. Naruto simply stared at the woman incredulously before narrowing his eyes slightly. So, you were making a joke? The Shinju just stared at him evenly, not dignifying that with a response. After a moment or two Naruto relented, a brief sigh escaping his lips as his posture slumped a little. A second later though and his gaze was back up, Rinnegan eyes searching Kagaya's face curiously, as if looking for something he expected to be there. Because he certainly couldn't feel it within himself. Where are the biju? Where is Kurama? Kagaya's regal visage simply blinked once, letting Naruto know everything he needed to. He looked down, a troubled frown secured firmly on his face. They are not gone, as you might imagine. You humans have such defined notions of what is and isn't. They are simply part of the whole they were once separated from, returned to how they were, chakra. Naruto's frown only deepened and the Shinju was reminded of the single time Hagoromo Otsutsuki had talked with it, as a much younger man than it chose to represent him as. How is that fair? They had lives, personalities, bonds, and feelings of their own. Is all of that just gone now? Again, he was met by that cold, immovable stare as the very first user of chakra regarded him, not curiously, but some approximation of the emotion. Like I stated, you humans rarely understand these things. Are your bonds meaningless when your corporeal form rots away? When that fickle immaterial notion of a soul passes onto the pure world? The fragments of myself may have fooled themselves with the concept that their lack of physical forms granted them an immortality, but they had their lives, as all things will and must. The Shinju saw it had done nothing to ease the concern of the young human sitting before it. However, they are not dead. As Naruto looked up, the Jubi caught a flicker of that strange human concept so alien to itself enter his eyes: hope. What did the Shinju have to hope for? It was, is, and will be, humans were truly an enigma. What do you mean? Naruto didn't understand. If what the Shinju was saying was true, he would never see Kurama again, never get to talk with Madatabi or stroke Shikaka's head. They are me, I am them, I am not dead, they live. Naruto blinked slowly and the Shinju nearly sighed. You once asked me whether or not biju really ate, and I told you while the chakra within us needed no sustenance or replenishment, we could still taste. Naruto's frown was slowly beginning to slip away. I asked Kurama that. The Shinju just nodded slowly and Naruto's eyes opened a little wider. The being sitting before him genuinely didn't understand the difference. So, what does that make you now, if you are what they have become? The blonde blinked in surprise when the image in front of him smiled mysteriously, betraying that previously stoic facade. I am. We are. At that Naruto just sighed and scratched the back of his head. It was like trying to talk to Master Chikako right after he meditated. So, what will you do now? The smile slipped away and once again silence reigned over the two for an awkward few seconds. I imagine the one called Madara will wish to return the world to a state this one, Kagaya, also tried to enact, the eternal Tsukuyami. It is not a terrible state, and not one I am unfamiliar with, even if the self that began that way, is not the self sitting before you. This time Naruto resisted scratching his head as he puzzled out the enigmatic being's unintentionally cryptic words. But what do you want to do? The Shinju regarded him oddly as Naruto felt strange tremors of indiscernible emotions ripple through the blank world. I do not want. I am. At that Naruto crossed his arms, irritation finally overcoming his confusion, as it was his turn to level a penetrating stare at the most powerful being in the world. Kurama wanted freedom. The Shinju raised a deceptively delicate eyebrow at the young, rather brazen boy. I failed to dash. The eyebrow rose higher as Naruto suddenly raised a hand, cutting the being off mid-sentence. Shikako wanted me to scratch behind his ears, Madatabi wanted to talk to someone, Isaba wanted somewhere quiet, Son Goku wanted people to call him by his name, Kokua wanted to argue with me, Saiken wanted someone that wouldn't fear his touch, Chome wanted to fly and Gyuki wanted a partner. Naruto stood up, his eyes blazing with an unnatural glow as they glared at the delicate form of the Shinju sitting before him. Don't tell me that you do not want, if there is even a scrap of them left within you. If everything that makes you came from them now, as you've just said, then everything that made them who they are now makes you who you are. Even if you do not understand the concept of desiring something, that does not mean you lack such a concept. Another heavy silence fell as slowly the Shinju's form got to its feet in a practiced and graceful manner that belonged to somebody else. You are a curious being, Naruto Uzumaki. Another pause as it scrutinized him, seemingly looking past him at something Naruto couldn't hope to see. Yes, I remember those wants, and even now they cause paradoxes within me, the cracks of the fragments joining together again as it were. All at once I feel the need to separate, to have my individuality return to me, and at the same time I wish nothing more than to become what I was, even though I know that is impossible. Do you humans have a word for this feeling? Despite the emotionless delivery, Naruto couldn't help it as his expression softened slightly. It's called a dream. The Shinju tested the word, as if trying it out, finding it to have a strange quality it couldn't quite figure out. Why would you humans chase what you know to be impossible? Naruto shrugged slowly. I'm not sure, it's just what humans do. It gives our lives purpose and something to hope for, it validates our existence. If we didn't have a dream, then what would be the purpose in our existence? Without dreams, without hopes, our only reason to stay alive would be our fear of death. The Shinju considered his words. This was only the second human it had ever talked to whilst whole, and it was very strange how similar the two seemed to be. It made the old entity wonder if this was the reincarnation of that very same man that had once imprisoned and divided it. I still do not understand your question then. Why must I want? Before you humans interfered, as you are prone to do, I did not even understand the concept of wanting, yet time continued and the world still prevailed. It was pointless for me to want anything back then. Again Naruto struggled to find an answer, knowing silence at this moment would be of no use. This conversation felt important, immeasurably so, yet he couldn't figure out why. Because like you said, you are not what you used to be, right? The Shinju hummed thoughtfully, obviously a trait it had picked up from one of its many containers, perhaps even Naruto himself. I could return though, what this Madara proposes, it would return the world to how it once was. I would possess my chakra again, rightfully returned from your thieving race. There was a long, tense pause as Naruto genuinely thought the being had made up its mind, or consensus. It was a little confusing. However, that would mean losing this self, and for some reason I find that idea less than ideal. Naruto blinked. It was odd to watch such a powerful, basically omnipotent being have a moment of identity crisis. You don't want to give up the individuality you have gained. The Shinju looked up, although in reality it was just the visual manifestation. Naruto was probably inside the Shinju, so it couldn't look up. Is that normal? Naruto shrugged again. What was normal? For a human, I suppose so. Everybody wants to be acknowledged, nobody wants to exist without purpose, and now that you have a self, something that you can actually identify yourself with, you finally can have something you never had before, an identity, a purpose. Even if you don't need one right now, do you want to lose the chance to ever have one? The Shinju said nothing, remaining unmoving as a further silence pervaded the empty world. I suppose that is a point of view. Naruto smiled lightly. Sometimes it was like talking to an impossibly wise and all-knowing being, other times he felt as though he were talking to a child. Then, what do you want? The Shinju let out a long breath, a rather useless action in a world that probably didn't even possess oxygen. I do not know. Naruto shrugged slowly at that. It was a start, at least the entity wasn't rejecting the concept outright anymore. That's okay, not knowing what you want isn't a bad thing. Many people don't know what they want to do with their lives, and spend it searching for their purpose. For many others that search becomes their purpose, until they find something else. Again, another stare. It was slightly unnerving to be looked at so intensely, knowing that this was actually an unfathomable being of chakra once regarded as a god. Save I am not people. Naruto shrugged, feeling that the conversation might begin to circle if he wasn't careful. But you can obviously think like one. There it was again, that strange, mysterious smile that seemed off on the face the Shinju chose, yet at the same time perfect. You are an interesting human, Naruto Uzumaki. Now the conversation really was starting to circle. You said that already. The smile never dropped this time as the Shinju slowly descended back into the traditional Saiza position. It managed it much better than Naruto could, considering he much preferred a meditative position than the more formal ways. He supposed that was the years spent observing Kaguya herself through the chakra they had shared. It is no less true than before. Naruto was at a loss again. He could have sworn that was a joke. The Shinju just continued to smile. I should hate you. Naruto's eyebrow rose curiously, wondering just where that came from, and as if hearing his thoughts, which it likely was. The Shinju elaborated. You are human, you belong to a people that ripped my chakra from me, disseminated it between your unworthy, immature, and volatile race, and locked me away. Naruto waited with slightly bated breath, but the Shinju didn't continue. But you don't? It was a cautious question, probing more than asking, and the Shinju almost seemed to want to disregard it and him. Shouldn't I? Naruto hadn't been expecting a question in return, and the Shinju never dropped its slight smile as he scrambled for an answer. The blonde may have been able to keep a straight face and his emotions in check, but in this world, their minds interconnected, he was an open book. Can you judge an entire species by the actions of their predecessors? Does a child deserve to suffer because of something its parent or grandparent did? The Shinju's smile never wavered, and it was highly unsettling how accurately it replicated the expression. I do not have to judge your entire species. Your people wage almost constant war, still using my chakra to spill blood and spread hatred using your kind, the Jinchuriki. Your shinobi twist the teachings of my first Jinchuriki's ninshu into ninjutsu, use chakra that was supposed to link men and use it instead to kill them. Your species has an ability unlike any others to wage war and turn anything into a weapon. Naruto frowned and for once no answer came to him. This was the same conversation he had with Nagato, and he was no better prepared for it now than he was then. What about the good? It came after a long moment of silence, sounding a little meek as Naruto stared at the non-existent floor. What about all the great things chakra has done for people, like healing them? Helping people fly? Allowing them to connect to nature? The Shinju only needed to consider the words for a moment. You would defend an entire species with the actions of so few? Naruto violently fought down the urge to shrug. How else was he supposed to defend humanity? Lights shine brighter in the dark. A single immaculate brow rose on Kaguya's face as she gave a long, thoughtful hum. Ah, the human concept of yin and yang, light and dark coexisting to provide contrast and enhance the other. He was also quite fond of the idea. For a long time the Shinju was quiet, not particularly seeming to look at anything. You do realize that the easier path would be to accept this eternal Tsukuyomi. Humanity would gain the peace it so often seems to crave yet never actually lets itself have for long. Naruto smiled easier at that and couldn't help himself as he indulged a habit he hadn't in a few years. My master once told me that the easier paths only exist because a long time ago, somebody was brave enough to step off an easy path and make a new one. Once again Naruto was placed under the harsh scrutiny of the Shinju's stare, and after what felt like minutes, but was likely only a few seconds, it released a small hum. Of approval or disparagement, he couldn't be sure, but it finally felt as though some resolution had been found. Interesting, I can see your soul laid bare before me. I know the answers you will make before even you do, and yet you somehow manage to surprise me. Maybe I should apologize for trying to kill you? Naruto blinked as the Shinju seemed to say the last part mostly to itself. In the end, though, it simply shrugged, Kaguya's form somehow making the simply gesture seem like the epitome of elegance. However, the blonde managed to get over his mild shock as he realized what the Jubi had just said. Wait. Wait. If you know what I'm going to say before I say it, why bother asking? Another smile crossed Kaguya's beautiful face, and for the briefest moments Naruto saw a hint of Kurama in that smirk. Because it is amusing, of course. Then the Shinju lightly tapped Naruto on the chest and all he saw was white, again. Madara blinked rapidly, getting used to the feeling of having two eyes again as he tested his vision, morphing into each stage of his jujutsu and back before crossing his arms over his chest with a smug, satisfied smirk. Everything was coming together now. All he had to do was wait for the Shinju to bloom and decades of waiting would finally be over. He would have his eternal victory in the Tsukuyomi. There weren't even any other shinobi around to try and stop him. The location was far too desolate. It was all perfect. Then that perfection gained a tiny crack as the Shinju swayed slightly. It drew Madara's eye, but he didn't think too much on it. The petals were still parting after all. Then the roots began to convulse, writhing about and actually pulling themselves from the earth. Rinnegan eyes narrowed, but this could still be considered normal, just part of the plan. Then the blossom of the god tree closed and Madara knew there was a problem. Slowly the wood began to warp and contort, and before Madara's rapidly widening eyes the Shinju actually shrank away. It twisted and contracted as though caught in some giant version of Obito's Kamui. If Madara didn't know the wayward Uchiha was firmly unconscious, he might have actually suspected his student. However, after a moment of terseness, Madara knew this was something else as the enormous form of the god tree dwindled away like a plant growing in reverse. There, standing resolutely in the crater the tree had made, a bright flaming haori of white chakra surrounding him, was Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto looked down at his hands, marveling at the strange cloak that hovered about his form. It didn't extend to his entire body like his normal biju shroud, but just clung to him. It was warm and comforting, and just being in contact with it filled him with energy unlike anything he had ever experienced before. His hair was lifted away from his face by the pressure of the chakra surrounding him to reveal his Rinnegan, now blood-red with 9 tomo swimming gently along their predetermined rings. He looked down at his right hand in particular, smiling as he saw the small white seed resting in his palm before nodding with determination and understanding. Then his eyes turned up. Madara and Naruto faced each other for a single inexplicable moment of tense silence, one seething with anger and hatred, the other a picture of calm determination. All at once the air around both seemed to explode as two objects, faster than most shinobi could even follow, sped towards one another, leaving rings of air in their wake. Earth-shattering ripples of displaced air rocked the ground and tore up the earth beneath them as punches and kicks were blocked and thrown with reckless abandon. Madara sneered as he realized the young boy hovering across from him was able to match him blow for blow, but had yet to retaliate or try an attack of his own. He shot back, black chakra bubbling off his shikuju to rocket through the air at the blonde. His surprise when said blonde simply caught the black balls was hard to describe. Naruto simply stared at the strange material energy with curiosity. It tried to eat into his skin and flesh like it had a mind of its own, but it was heavily restrained by a perfectly formed sphere of gravity that Naruto would have found impossible to form so precisely and so quickly without the Shinju's help. It was as though his chakra was now water flowing through his coils, so easy to control it was almost thoughtless. It's a combination of elemental chakra. The revelation caused Madara's clenched fist to tighten. How was the boy able to discern that so quickly? And that wasn't even the most pressing question. What did you do to the Shinju? What happened to my eternal Tsukuyomi? Naruto seemed to ignore him though as the boy continued to scrutinize the ball of chakra in his hand, analyzing it with eyes that simply picked the world apart and laid it bare before him. For elemental chakra, which means if I do the same with a shift forward on the cycle. An almost identical sphere of black chakra appeared out of the blonde's hand, and when he placed them together they both simply disappeared, like they were never there. Madara, tired of being ignored and frustrated beyond belief, madly sent wave after wave of the black chakra at the hovering blonde, hoping to wipe the monk from existence one excruciating part of his body at a time. However, Naruto simply raised his hand, a look of mild concentration crossing his features as the black orbs just vanished. That finally seemed to snap Madara out of it as he stared wide-eyed as one of the most powerful and unstoppable attacks he could create was effortlessly destroyed, again. Then Naruto was in front of him, a palm on his chest. The next moment he was in a crater on the ground larger than the one the Jubi had made when it fell. His chest was completely collapsed, and when Naruto gently touched down on the ground next to him, that infuriating haori of flaming chakra still surrounding his form, he could barely form words. How? Naruto stood over the defeated man, staring in silence for a good while, not quite sure what the man was asking. I created spheres of opposing elemental composition in the exact space yours took up, canceling them out. Madara shook his head, finding the action difficult even as his body healed. It was useless though, he was at the Uzumaki's mercy right now, he could barely even control his chakra. And no, how did you win? Naruto stared again, feeling a shred of pity enter his heart for this broken old man, disillusioned with the world to the point where he sought to make one of his own and drag the rest of humanity into it with him. You relied on your power alone, forcing others to help you where you could, like the Kyuubi and the Shinju. I let others help me, it gave me something to fight for, and in the end, I even let the Shinju help me. Madara now realized why the flaming coat of chakra seemed so familiar. It was the sign of a perfect Jinchuriki. Madara Uchiha had been defeated by a man that had done something even the sage of the six paths himself could not. Somehow, it only seemed fitting, and that was his final thought as Naruto knelt down, a finger to his forehead as he felt all of his chakra drain away from his body. Naruto stood up slowly, suddenly feeling an awful lot heavier as the brilliant haori of white flame dissipate from his body, the red in his Rinnegan bleeding away, and the tomo fading. He briefly considered Madara's cold, still body, as a long rod of black chakra formed in his hand. He tapped it on the ground once and the black seemed to melt away, leaving a perfectly ordinary wooden shakuja nestled in its place. He then quickly proceeded to lean on that as a wave of terrible exhaustion washed over him, nearly taking his feet out from under him. It was in that condition that he began his long walk back in the direction of Amigakure, feeling far too drained to consider a summon or anything faster than a gentle amble. He had won, but he was tired. Right now he wanted nothing more to climb back into bed with the girl he loved and revel in her warmth. The words of the Shinju still echoed in his mind, but he felt he could put them aside for a night. He had a lifetime ahead of him with Madara and the Akatsuki behind him. He had a lifetime to find a peace mankind had been seeking for so long. But most importantly to him, he now had a lifetime to spend with the people he cared about. Because that was what he had chosen to fight for. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.